All right. Well, hi, Dr. Greger. Thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast. I greatly appreciate it. And thank you for all of the work you've been doing recently in spreading the message about pandemics and also encouraging people to kind of think beyond just what we're told, I suppose, about where these pandemics start and originate from. So, yeah, thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. So the infamous kind of speech you did maybe, 12, 13 years ago now, is that kind of prophetic almost conference you did where you were talking about pandemics and ways to prevent pandemics. Since you've done that talk, there's been two pandemics. Of course, we're currently in one. Are you surprised that there's been two pandemics in the past decade? Does that come as a shock to you?
Well, predicting that there's going to be another pandemic is like predicting the sun's going to come up the next day. I mean, it's always when, never if. But then the next question is how bad. We got off lucky last time with the 2009 swine flu pandemic. It was only a category 1 pandemic. Only about 500,000 people died. But what we learned from that pandemic for the first time is that flu viruses can jump directly from pigs into the human population, circulate throughout the world. We may not be so lucky next time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with the current pandemic, it's obviously been traced, or likely has been traced back to the meat market in Wuhan. Now, I was in the US a couple of years ago, and I came across these kind of live animal markets in Brooklyn. There's also some in Texas when I was there. What's the likelihood of something similar originating from one of these live animal markets in somewhere like the US?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, it's easy for us kind of xenophobic Westerners to kind of poo-poo these, back alley wet markets in Asia. But for example, the last pandemic was largely made in the USA from industrial pork production facilities in the United States. And there are these live bird markets, particularly in the Northeast, also California here in the States, that have had concerning outbreaks of these H7 viruses, which have infected people. There was a New Yorker infected in 2003. Then in 2015, shelter cats across New York became infected with this bird flu virus that was found on those live animal markets. One of the veterinarians, one of the shelter workers also got infected. So this is a human-adapted virus, has not yet acquired the necessary mutations to transmit human to human effectively, which would trigger the next pandemic. But certainly live markets anywhere, Asia, the United States, Europe, anywhere else, are risk factors, and they should all be shut down. I think it's important to realize that even now in China, when supposedly these live markets are shut down, no, they just shut down the raising of wildlife meat. So the wildlife trade for fur, still ongoing. Wildlife trade for traditional Chinese medicines, still ongoing. Can still raise these animals, slaughter these animals, sell these animals, but just not for meat. And all farm animals are exempted. In fact, they even went in and changed the definition of like frogs and turtles to livestock, to farm animals, so they can continue to market them. And so there are still these massive live bird markets, in which case, at some of these markets, you can actually sample bird flu viruses straight out of the air. So even walking through one of these markets could be dangerous. The same thing was found at fairs here in the United States with swine flu viruses. There's so much virus being excreted by these animals, just gets in the air, causes people to get sick. And the more people that get sick, the more animals get sick, the more kind of pandemic spins at the roulette wheel, is just locking in the right mutations to then finally spread into the human population. So we really need to recognize that how we treat animals can have global public health implications.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that shocked me is after this current pandemic started, I was just typing into Google swine flu or avian flu, and just going on news that was just in the past week or past few weeks, and it's all the time. There's been outbreaks of a new, I think it's H5N6 strain in Germany of bird flu. And it just happens all the time, everywhere. And I suppose the one thing that I know that you're concerned about from things that you've spoken about before is one of these strains maybe mutating into something that's similar to H5N1 in terms of the fatality rate. So kind of combining like a highly infectious strain of avian influenza with a highly, a high fatality rate strain of avian influenza.
Yeah, so there's an important parallel here with coronaviruses. So until 2002, we thought all coronaviruses could do was cause the common cold. So we knew they were transmissible from person to person, but they just caused the sniffles. Then, boom, 2002, SARS emerges from these wet markets, these civet cats being raised in Guangdong province in China, in South China, and all of a sudden spreads around the world to over 20 countries, infects, about 8,000 people, 800 of which die. So it's about a 10% mortality rate. All of a sudden, coronaviruses could be deadly. We had no idea. Mm-hmm. And then the thought is, well, wait a second. If it can be transmissible and deadly, well, then there's no reason that this class of coronaviruses couldn't then trigger a global pandemic. And we got another warning call in 2012 with the emergence of MERS linked to intensive camel farming in the Middle East. Another deadly coronavirus disease killed about 1 in 3. We kept having warning sign after warning sign, but of course, we didn't listen. And in fact, the wildlife markets were shut down after SARS in China, but poorly enforced, rapidly reopened, and civet cats were back on the menu within months. And so similarly, the current wildlife ban in China is still only set to be temporary, as these whopping loopholes. If we don't permanently change the way we interact with animals, then we are just going to look at more and more pandemics coming down the pike. I mean, we are in unprecedented era in human history. We've had dozens of newly emerging and re-emerging diseases, most of which coming from animals. The AIDS virus blamed on the bushmeat trade in Africa, killing chimpanzees. We have SARS and COVID-19 for the wildlife trade, these live animal markets. We have, the swine flu, mad cow, when we started these cannibalistic feeding practices. The deadliest plague in history was a bird flu virus that emerged from the trenches in World War I to kill 50 million people in the pandemic of 1918. But from a virus standpoint, we have those same trench warfare conditions today in every industrial chicken shed, in every industrial egg operation, confined, crowded, stressed, but by the billions, not just millions. And now, as you said, we have viruses H5N1, H7N9 that could kill millions around the globe. If they lock in those necessary mutations. Right now, the CDC considers H7N9, which rose to ascendance in 2013, killing about 40% of the people infected, as our greatest pandemic risk. They recently released a threat scenario suggesting millions of Americans could die with an H7N9 pandemic. And so the silver lining here of COVID-19 is that hopefully the world will wake up and look around after, millions of lives lost, billions locked down, trillions of dollars lost around the world, finally sit down and take very seriously what those of us in this movement have been saying forever, and that is we need to accelerate the movement towards plant-based milks, plant-based meats, plant-based egg products, not just for human health, for chronic disease sake, not just for global warming. Global health is taking a whole nother view now. Now there's pandemic risk as well. And so we just need to move away towards healthier products, healthier for ourselves, healthier for future generations, and healthier in terms of reducing the risk of pandemic infectious disease.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really is this kind of, it's the key to solving so many of the world's current issues, is just simply changing our lifestyles and how we use animals. one thing that I think scares me about the 1918 pandemic is the fatality rate was only between 2 to 3%. But if we're talking about a strain of avian influenza that has a 40% fatality rate, I mean, the amount of damage that could cause is almost unimaginable. And we think about the social upheaval that's happening right now because of COVID-19, but imagine if the same virus right now was killing 40% of the people that it hit and was being completely non-discriminatory. It wasn't just people with underlying health conditions or of a certain age. It was anyone of any age, 40%. I mean, society would collapse.
I'm so glad you brought that up. This COVID-19 is just a dress rehearsal, right? Look, doctors are still showing up. The food is still being restocked on grocery store shelves. The internet may be slow, but it's still on. The electricity is still on. We're still getting, clean drinking water, right? All of that can go away if even suffering like 25% of the workforce out. And so, right, there's no reason. In fact, the World Health Organization actually convened a panel of experts to ask the question, wait a second, would a virus like H5N1, H7N9 necessarily have to ratchet down its lethality, its flip of the coin human lethality down in a pandemic situation? Because the worst pandemic in history was only 2%, with the last bird flu virus jumping the species barrier. And the answer was not necessarily. In other words, the nightmare scenario that you just described. So here in the States, 60 million Americans get the flu. Imagine if it turned deadly. So instead of, even here in the U.S., probably the worst case scenario estimates for COVID-19, 500,000 American deaths. That's 1 in 3,000 people. What if instead it was 10 times worse, 20 times worse, 1 in 15 dead, 1 in 6 dead, 25 times worse. This is that's why it's so critical, and that's why can't emphasize enough the risk that the world is taking. It may hopefully won't come to this, but we don't tend to shore up the levees of the laughter of disaster. And it may take a pandemic that wipes out millions of people before the world realizes the true cost of cheap chicken.
And yeah, exactly. And I think that's the scary thing, isn't it? Is we hope that we listen to what the world's telling us and what these infectious diseases should be able to teach us. But I guess the risk is that we just go back to business as usual when it dissipates. Why do you think that it's not something that our governments do take more seriously when the risk is so catastrophic? Apart from climate change, the United Nations says it's the second biggest risk to human health. So why don't we take it more seriously as a risk?
Well, because there are very important moneyed interests involved. So, for example, here in the States, we continue to feed millions of pounds of medically important antibiotics to farm animals by the truckload, something that every single human health organization on the planet is allied against. You say, wait a second, if every public health group on the planet says it's not a good idea to be feeding these critically important drugs to animals just to fatten them faster for slaughter, then why hasn't it been done? Why hasn't it been done? Because they're going up against two of the most powerful industries, the pharmaceutical industry that sells all these drugs and big ag, the animal agriculture industries. They have so much power hold, so much a stranglehold over our political system that even things that are just so slam dunk, common sense, scientific consensus, people are dying, are being consistently ignored. But again, there's the silver lining with COVID-19. Hopefully we'll get a pandemic that's just bad enough that people will pay attention so that an even worse pandemic can be prevented in the future. But of course, not bad enough. The minimum amount of suffering that will actually get us to prevent an even larger amount of suffering later on.
That is the hope, isn't it? I think one of the risks is that potential of people, as we say, employing that almost xenophobic tendency of just accusing Chinese culture of being the problem and overlooking the fact that industrialized agriculture in anywhere across the world plays a part in these pandemic risks. I suppose if we don't change, the chance for pandemic is not really an if, it's always going to be a when, right? Like, as long as we do what we do. I mean, obviously the industrialization of agriculture isn't the only risk potential, but it's one of the biggest drivers in risk potential. And so I guess if we don't change, then it will always be a matter of when the next one happens, how bad will it be, as opposed to otherwise we're just playing that fingers crossed game, aren't we? Just hoping that it never happens. But of course, mathematically, it always must do at some point if we don't change.
And it's getting worse and worse. Never before have we seen flu viruses. One of the few viruses capable of infecting literally billions of people within a matter of months. Never have we seen a flu virus with an Ebola-like lethality. 50%, there are strains of Ebola that only kill 50%. That's what we're facing with something like with some of these bird flus. And there's no biological reason that they couldn't trigger a pandemic. Even the coronaviruses, again, MERS, 1 in 3 have died who've gotten it. SARS, 1 in 10. Currently with COVID-19, probably we're looking at about a 0.5% case fatality rate. And so, I mean, that's why it could just be so much worse. So as devastating, and not to underplay how devastating COVID-19 is, but I mean, it could get so much worse. And so that, I think, is the message that public health professionals have been shouting from the rooftops for decades and need to get out there. The American Public Health Association, the largest and oldest association of public health professionals in the world, has called for a moratorium on factory farming for more than 20 years. The Pew Commission on Industrial Animal Production, the same thing. We got to ban some of these practices like gestation crates and battery cages, which cram animals together. You know, when we overcrowd animals in these cramped, filthy football field-sized cages to lie beak to beak or snout to snout atop their own waist, it's just a breeding ground for disease, right? The sheer number of animals, the overcrowding, the stress crippling their immune systems, the ammonia from all the decomposing waste burning their lungs, the lack of fresh air, the lack of sunlight. I mean, put all these factors together, you have the kind of perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of these so-called super strains of influenza. These factory farms are a public health menace, but it may not be enough just to, tinker around the